Thanks so much, Nico. And hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Today I'm going to talk about Project Zero. It's been 10 years since the team was founded, and I've been around for most of them. First as a security researcher, and now as a team lead. Today, I want to take you on our team's journey. How we started, what happened, and what we've learned from over 10 years of fighting 0 days. You might remember Project Zero being announced in this Wired article. That's Geo Hot, our team's first intern, in front of what is clearly a very high glare monitor. The team was announced in the wake of a number of high-profile incidents involving 0 days. There was the Aurora incident, in which state-sponsored attackers gained access to Google's systems, and there were frequent reports of other targeted 0-day attacks. The terrible impact of such attacks was also becoming clear. They affected people's privacy, their ability to use technology, and even their personal safety. Project Zero was started as a dedicated effort to prevent these attacks. This led to our mission, make 0 day hard. But deconstructing a bit, what does this mean? To start off, what do we mean by a 0 day? A definition you'll frequently hear is a vulnerability that an attacker knows about, but defenders don't. But I've never really liked this definition, because it doesn't explain the relationship between the defenders, the bug, and the attackers. What really happens is that there's an attacker, usually state-sponsored, sometimes a totalitarian government, who wants to compromise a victim, often a politician, government official, academic, or activist. The sort of target who, if they're suppressed or monitored, it doesn't just affect the individual, but their organization and society at large. Anyhow, this attacker might know what software this victim uses, and they will look and look and look for a vulnerability in that software, and then they'll exploit it, and they'll use it against this target and likely others. This can go on for a very long time, sometimes even years, before defenders detect the issue and remediate it. This is what we mean by a 0 day. Project Zero focuses on targeted attacks. This means the attacker is targeting a specific victim, usually to gain access to the data on their device. Occasionally, 0 days are used for other types of attacks, like ransomware or stealing trade secrets or financial attacks. And this is also a problem, but that's not the focus of our team. Another subtlety here is that we are focused on end users, the individual human victims of attacks, as opposed to, say, attacks on businesses. Project Zero is vendor agnostic. This means we don't focus on Google's software or any other vendor. We try to follow attackers to where they are and reduce 0 days in the software they target the most. Now, what do we mean by hard? Well, I wish I knew. This is an area where metrics are still developing. Ideally, we would have a world where these attacks are extremely rare. One hope we have is to make 0 day capabilities more expensive. And for some attackers, this means real financial cost. Attackers can buy exploits, giving them the capabilities they need from a variety of vendors. Here's a sample price table from a vendor called Zerodium, who publicly buys exploits and presumably sells them to attackers. So if you look at the very top of this table, there is the Android full chain persistent 0-click. This means if someone finds a vulnerability in an Android device and exploits it, and it gives an attacker access to the data on all Android devices without the victim touching the device, and the user can reset their device, start it up again, and the attacker still has access, Zerodium claims to pay $2.5 million for that exploit. And it's important to note that this does not represent the cost per victim, because these exploits can be used against many different victims. They can be used more than once. But this is a really good representation of what the investment in a zero-day is for an attacker. So one of our hopes is to push these prices even higher so that some attackers get priced out of this market. Though this isn't a great metric in itself, as what causes exploit prices to go up can be fairly complex. Another way to see this is making finding and exploiting zero days more technically complex. And at Project Zero, we have thought about this a lot and come up with a lot of different things this could mean. It could mean that it takes attackers more time to find a vulnerability. It could mean that more attackers find this same vulnerability and are contending over the same attack surface. It could mean that bugs don't live as long, that when attackers start using them, they get fixed right away. It could mean there are fewer new attack surfaces. But what all these things have in common is it means that it takes attackers more time and more effort to get a capability, and the capability is less reliable and doesn't last as long. Project Zero is structured with these goals in mind. We're a team of roughly 12 security researchers from a variety of backgrounds, including government, academia, product security teams, and bug bounties. And we have various areas of technical expertise that kind of map to the areas where we see zero days the most. So iOS, Android, Windows, Linux, and browsers mostly. Our work is largely self-directed, which means that the team defines its own strategy, apart from the broader Google. But it also means that individual team members have a lot of freedom to pursue individual research areas and projects. These days, there are fortunately several other teams that do work similar to Project Zero, but in 2014, this was completely new, having a team that was free from other business responsibilities, focused entirely on the broad problem of ongoing zero days, and empowered to publish research and interact with industry. So as the team was started, many early conversations centered around the root cause of zero days. What needed to change in industry to reduce the vast harm they've done, and how can we encourage these shifts? There were four main problems: software quality, transparency, patching, and mitigations. Let's go through each one of these. So the first problem was software quality. Back when the team started, software really had a lot of vulnerabilities in it. It was pretty easy to find a zero day in a specific target. And why did this happen? My opinion is a lack of security programs that prioritized reducing the number of real exploitable vulnerabilities in software. I feel this is the fundamental cause, full stop. But when I started talking to vendors, the reasons became more interesting. At the time, it was clear that a lot of industry didn't fully understand the harm zero days caused. A lack of visibility was a problem, as other types of attacks are more detectable. Why worry about zero days when we can see people phishing right now was a common conversation I had. And of course, other security problems are important too, but zero days were unreasonably deprioritized considering the impact they have on victims. And I kind of don't blame vendors, because there was a real lack of technical information about how vulnerabilities worked. And at the time, it wasn't unusual for software makers to have strange, disconnected ideas about the scope of the problem and what might prevent it. Vendors tended to overestimate the resources required to write a working exploit, and would also sometimes doubt the technical capabilities of exploits. For example, whether it was possible to have a zero-click exploit or an exploit without visual indicators. So one main way that Project Zero tries to improve software quality is by doing vulnerability research. We look for vulnerabilities in the same software attackers target and report them so they get fixed. One big benefit is that this illuminates what is possible. It's hard to argue against a working exploit. But it also directly improves software quality. Getting the most obvious vulnerabilities in software fixed makes them more difficult for attackers to find. We also hope for bug collision, which means that an attacker is using a bug that we find right now, and when it gets fixed, they can't use it anymore. And there's actually a fair bit of evidence that this is happening, and we think it is happening more and more as time goes on. Our vulnerability research also sometimes leads to structural improvements, such as attack surface reduction. Sometimes this is because we make a vendor aware of an attack surface that they don't know about or didn't know was exposed. But also, it's sometimes due to the effort of handling multiple bug reports. If a vendor has to fix 50 bugs in a component, they might start to wonder, is there a better way we can deal with this? For example, removing that component entirely. One question you might have is, how does Project Zero select research targets? Our goal is to target the same software that attackers use against their victims, but of course, they don't exactly call us up and tell us what they're doing. So we use the best data we have. The very best source of data is 0 days that are detected in the wild. Sometimes Google Tag or other organizations will actually detect a real attacker, and then we can look at what target they targeted, for example. And this is also not perfect data because our detection capabilities are skewed. For example, it's a lot easier to detect an attack against a browser as opposed to, say, a fully remote mobile attack. So the data there isn't perfect either. But certainly, if 0 days detected in the wild, we know that at least some attackers are interested in that target, so Project Zero will almost always look at it. But we use other sources of information, too. Another is price lists, like the one I showed you from Zerodium at the beginning of the presentation. We have public ones, and then sometimes there's leaks, or people will share these with us. We also occasionally talk to folks on the other side of the aisle and hear tips or rumors on what is being targeted. Of course, there's no guarantees these are accurate. They have an incentive to mislead us. But once again, this data is better than nothing. Finally, sometimes we'll find a target just based on gut feel. There's a lot of experienced researchers on Project Zero, so sometimes we just have a sense of what targets are likely to have many high-quality vulnerabilities. We focus on stuff that's widely used because we want to focus on the bugs that affect users most. Since Project Zero is focused on targeted attacks, we don't look at B2B software or IoT because right now there's not a lot of evidence that these are used in attacks targeting end users. But we're keeping our eye on this, and it could change. But back to software quality. To help explain how the various good outcomes of vulnerability research can combine to have a large impact on software quality, I want to share the example of browsers. In 2014, browser 0 days were rampant, and this is mostly due to Adobe Flash. In 2014, Flash vulnerabilities were fairly easy to find. This is an early Flash vulnerability I found. It's in fact the first vulnerability I found on Project Zero. And this is a very simple bug. The Adobe Flash engine expects microphone.codec, a property, to be a string, but if you make it an integer, it gets treated like a pointer, and this ends up being an exploitable vulnerability. This is typically called a host function vulnerability because it occurs in the handling of the parameters of a script API. And it's one of the simplest types of vulnerabilities that happen in browsers. So in 2014, there were 2 Flash 0 days. Then in 2015, this started to ramp up. There was one every month, which was unheard of at the time with the detection capabilities we had. But there was also a lot of research interest. Project Zero reported hundreds of bugs in this space in 2015, as did other researchers. I specifically want to acknowledge Kihu, Tencent, and Nicola Jolie. There started to be a lot of bug collisions among defensive researchers, and we started to find a lot of the same bugs. I remember Pwn to Own that year was absolutely wild. If you don't know, Pwn to Own is a hacking competition. And they'll set up a laptop with, say, a browser with Flash in it, and then each competitor is invited to hack that target. And if they do it with a completely new bug that the vendor didn't know about, they get to keep the device, and they get a cash prize. But then every competitor that wins gets points, and they get added up. And then the very best competitor gets this interesting Master of Pwn jacket, plus an additional cash prize. So what happened was, for Adobe Flash that year, every team that was participating came with 10 to 20 working Flash vulnerabilities. because they were so afraid that someone else had found the bug or another competitor would use it first. And then they all went in turn and they compromised Flash. And then they all immediately reported their remaining bugs to Adobe so that the next team couldn't use them, and then they had a higher chance at the jacket. So this ended in Adobe walking away with a lot of vulnerabilities, and slowly the low-hanging fruit in Flash started to get fleshed out. You might also remember the hacking team leak happened in 2015. This was a situation where an exploit vendor got compromised and all their emails were dumped online. And you could see through this the impact that defensive security research was having on them. They didn't have the in-house ability to find and exploit Flash vulnerabilities, so they would buy them from a third party. And you could see them, buying an exploit, and then, it would get closed due to a vulnerability our team or someone else found, and then they'd be like, oh no, we need a new one, we need a new one, and they kept having to buy more and more exploits over and over. And you could see them asking their vendor, like, hey, do you have anything slightly different, because they keep getting fixed. So that was good evidence that this sort of research was impacting real attackers. So these events started to put pressure on Adobe, both with regards to the sheer volume of fixes, but also the public perception of Flash being insecure. And this led to Flash deprecation. This was really hard, and I want to thank everyone involved, especially from Adobe, Microsoft, and Google. This represented a lot of progress in making browser 0 days hard, as this big browser attack surface that had once contained the majority of exploitable bugs was now gone. I can confidently say that due to the work of defensive researchers in this space, the number of Flash 0 days affecting users today is 0. But attackers don't give up, and it was widely speculated that they would move to browsers. This opened the door to a lot of research into browser engines, and the same events repeated themselves. There was another great pwn to own, and also a lot of research. I remember going to Hack in the Box in 2017 to give a presentation on some bugs I'd found in Microsoft Edge. And Tencent showed up, and they gave a presentation, and they had found almost the same bugs that I had. There was so much research going on that researchers were kind of crashing into each other, which is good. And as the bugs got reported, they started to become more sparse, and the sort of host function bugs I showed at the beginning became much less common. This is a sample of the sort of vulnerability that might have been reported in a browser around 2017. This was in Microsoft Edge, and it was reported by Lockheed Hart on Project Zero. And the important part here is if you look at those arrows, they point to different objects. And this is a missing check in the just-in-time compilation engine. So when this code gets compiled into a native code, there's type checks missing from those two areas. This is what makes this vuln works. So this just represents a much higher understanding of the browser and the script engine compared to that microphone bug I showed you. So a few things happened after this. Chakra, the Microsoft Edge JavaScript engine, got deprecated, and Edge moved to Chromium. And this left us with 3 major browsers, which meant that there were even less attack surface being contended against by attackers. Then in 2022, Internet Explorer was finally deprecated, largely for security reasons. This is another example of how security research can lead to structural security improvements that can have a larger impact than fixing the individual bugs. So this is a sample browser vulnerability from 2023. And I'm not going to explain this one, but it is a JIT issue that included an 8-page PDF explaining it. And not every bug we find these days is this complex. This one was reported by Sergey Glazunov of Project Zero. But the important thing is this is just, so much bigger than that microphone bug. And 10 years ago, this is a bug that no one would have cared about because it's so complicated and there were other bugs. But now we do, because this is kind of what is left. But did we solve software quality? No. There has not been a clear decrease in 0 days being detected in the wild. I want to give the caveat that this is extremely difficult to measure. It's not clear that an increased detection means increased exploitation because detection quality is improving really, really fast, and exploits can be used more than once. And also, the number of humans who use a smartphone has increased a lot in the past 10 years. And it's not clear whether this would lead to, more or less exploitation or detection, but this is another confounding factor that makes this less accurate. But the reality is that we could be seeing strong indications that attacks are going down, and we're not. Part of this is that attackers have compensated by expending more effort. There's anecdotal evidence that attackers are using larger teams to discover bugs, and we're seeing this in open research too. For example, I heard someone comment that Pwn to Own has now become a team sport. And this is promising with regards to bug sparsity, but it means the attacks are still happening. Another thing I want to call out is the rise of exploitation as a service. We don't have full visibility into the exploit industry, but when the team started, most sellers we knew about sold full exploits, either exclusive or non-exclusive, for a set fee. This has slowly been overtaken by vendors that sell exploits as a service. This means that an attacker can pay per user compromised, often via a system that requires almost no technical skills to use. And this means that 0 days are more accessible, especially to actors with fewer resources, as this costs a lot less. And these are the ones with the most concerning motives. So exploitation as a service has countered increasing bug sparsity as well. Also, the improvement we're seeing is not equal among the software we look at. Some targets, to give recent examples, baseband and Android drivers have a lot of simple bugs. Also, even what I might characterize as hard attack surfaces sometimes have trivial bugs added as a part of new features when kind of dev processes fail. So that's a problem. And finally, even when everything goes right, when nothing wrong happens with a target, attackers still manage to find and exploit them. So while software quality is improving, it is clearly not enough to stop attackers. So the next problem Project Zero had to deal with in 2014 was transparency. Project Zero's position is that a good defense requires a detailed knowledge of offense. For example, imagine you're a developer trying to defend a browser against 0 days. How could you ever expect to do this if you had never seen a working vulnerability, if you'd never seen a working exploit? This information is necessary for defenders to be able to secure their software. Meanwhile, in 2014, the transparency situation was actually quite bad. A lot of industry had reservations about releasing technical information about bugs, and not very much got released. There was the odd talk at Black Hat or blog post, but a lot of good information got held back. This was partly due to concerns that the information would benefit attackers. I would say that views were very conservative back then. Companies were afraid of ever helping attackers, even if the benefit was very high. And there was also a lot of concern about the PR impact of releasing any information. And of course, there was a lot of hostility to researchers who decided to share information anyway. So Project Zero challenged this norm by publishing as much as we could, including every bug we found, exploits, and blog posts. And I want to point out that at the time, this was quite a radical approach. I don't think there was any research team that published as much information as we did. We got a lot of criticism. But as we continued to release this information, a lot of the negative fallout that was predicted didn't happen, and the industry began to change. Almost every vendor does security advisories now, and a lot do public security research, for example, Microsoft, Apple, and Meta. We also had success promoting in-the-wild notification. It used to be common that vendors did not tell anyone if they suspected an issue that had been recently patched had been actively used by real attackers, which meant that users wouldn't know to prioritize that patch. Maddie Stone and some others on the team worked with industry to make in-the-wild notification the standard, and every major vendor we work with has now agreed to do this. But did we solve transparency? No. Though we've made a lot of progress on this one. Compared to software quality, I think I'm actually feeling pretty positive. But there's still a huge gap between public and private knowledge. My gut feeling is that this is getting smaller, but we are still frequently surprised by what we see in the small number of real attacker exploits we get access to. That said, overall, transparency has improved a great amount in the past 10 years, and I'm sure we can do even better. I'm excited for what the next 10 years will hold. So the next problem in 2014 was patching. In 2014, a lot of vendors didn't understand the urgency of fixing researcher-reported security issues, even though they have a lot of potential to harm users. In fact, this was an existential concern about creating the team. Was it even possible to do public security research if fix times spanned years? We created the 90-day disclosure policy in 2014 to deal with the general lack of response to security bug reports. Well, it's been through many iterations. The general idea is that Project Zero makes the technical details of all vulnerabilities it finds public after 90 days, whether they've been fixed or not. This policy was very unpopular. A lot of vendors did not believe they could fix every vulnerability in 90 days. A lot of vendors didn't believe they could fix any vulnerability in 90 days. Also, there was a great deal of concern about releasing 0 days that were unfixed. The general consensus was that this could never be worthwhile. So what happened? This pretty much worked. Patching got way faster. We went from this is not technically possible to most vendors doing it within years. Also, many vendors who were sick of software they relied on not being patched adopted their own 90-day policies. They are fairly uncontroversial at this point. But did we solve patching? I'm sure you can guess the answer at this point. We still have problems. I think the biggest one right now is that about 40% of vulnerabilities detected in the wild are variants. This means that they're very similar to other vulnerabilities that have already been fixed in the same software. The exact number each year varies, but it's quite high. And what this actually means deep down is that patches are incomplete, that vendors are not fully patching security issues. And we've tried several policy tweaks, including immediately disclosing variants, but nothing has really worked. So if you're a developer sitting in the audience wondering, what is one thing I can do when I get home to prevent 0 days? I would suggest go through your code base, look at every 0 day that has ever been fixed there, and write a test case and make sure that it's really been fixed. This is called variant analysis, and it's one of the lowest effort, highest reward things you can do with regards to preventing 0 days. A related issue is inconsistent patching for Android devices. Many third-party components in Android's patching is, well, patchy. There's still a lot of devices, especially lower-cost ones, that don't get consistent updates for a variety of reasons. There's also a new problem where vendors will get around our policies by patching their open source tree or issuing an advisory, and this will meet the requirements of our disclosure policy, but then this patch will not make it to users or not make it to users until a long time has passed. To give a concrete example, we reported some vulnerabilities in a Samsung baseband chip that was used by Pixel devices, and Samsung eventually issued an advisory which made this marked as fixed in our tracker. But then it was much longer before actual Pixel users got the patch, and there are probably still some users that are unpatched. And this isn't specifically a Samsung problem or a Pixel problem. This is something we see frequently with a lot of vendors and a lot of OEMs. Also, we still regularly encounter vendors who have never shipped a security fix before, which is surprising. But I guess there really is a lot of software made by a lot of vendors on phones. So the final problem we dealt with was mitigations. This cute little guy is the mitigator. He was drawn by Halvar Flake, who spent a couple of years on Project Zero. And the joke is that mitigations back then tended to just marginally raise the bar on the exploitation, just to the extent that they prevented visibility. Of course, by 2014, there were a lot of great mitigations. There were stack cookies, heap protections, ASLR. But vendors took a look at this and thought there might be one mitigation to rule them all, that they just had to find the right mitigation and they wouldn't have to fix bugs anymore, They wouldn't have to release patches anymore. They could get off the treadmill. They never had to worry about their legacy code. And they moved resources away from initiatives that reduced the number of bugs in software, when really, the best mitigation just adds extra steps. For example, ASLR means that exploits require at least 2 bugs to get code execution usually, which is way better than 1, but it doesn't mean you don't have to fix a bug again. So the overestimation of the effectiveness of mitigations led to poor security practices. Project Zero addressed this problem by testing the effectiveness of mitigations, which is another word for reading exploits. This is the most effective way to really know how much a mitigation holds an attacker back. We also analyze real-world exploits to see how real attackers bypass mitigations. So, quick plug here, if you've been a victim of a 0-day and you have binaries, we'd like to chat about sharing them with us for analysis, because I think this is some of the best information we get, and we do appreciate these types of samples. We also help vendors develop effective mitigations, both by helping them test ideas and contributing to open source mitigations. To give an example of how our research can improve mitigations, I'll share the example of iMessage. Up until 2019, there was wide speculation that fully remote attacks against iMessage were possible, but there wasn't strong evidence of this until a Reuters article that detailed the use of such bugs in the UAE with harsh consequences for the victims. Based on a few technical details in this article, Project Zero researched iMessage and found several bugs in serialization. And Samuel Gross demonstrated that these bugs were exploitable. As a result of this and other research, Apple implemented Blastdoor, which is basically a sandbox for iMessage deserialization and some other mitigations that made exploitation more difficult. Then in 2021, Citizen Lab detected an iMessage exploit in the wild. By the way, I want to give them a big thanks for this. This was really excellent work. We analyzed this exploit, and it was substantially more technically complex than the exploit we wrote. You might remember it involved implementing a little Turing machine in the JBig2 parser, and this was likely because Blastdoor made exploitation more difficult. Of course, there are 2 ways of looking at this. One is that Apple responded well to active attacks by implementing this mitigation. The other is that it's surprising, maybe even unacceptable, that up until 2021, iMessages were parsed in a highly privileged context without sandboxing. I think both of these views are actually right. But regardless, it's clear that Blastdoor has had the impact of increasing exploit complexity. But there's still issues with mitigations. But they are different problems. Mitigations are expensive with regards to development time and other factors, so there's not always incentives to add them. I would say in 2014, mitigations were a problem, because ineffective attempts to solve all exploitation led to poor security practices. A lot of vendors skipped on initiatives that would increase software quality and patching, with the belief that the next big mitigation would make them irrelevant. Now that that point of view is starting to fade, mitigations are becoming an opportunity. There's some new mitigations, especially memory tagging, that have the potential to make exploitation substantially more difficult if they are used as a supplement instead of a substitute for a security program. Something that we've observed is that offensive researchers are becoming more reluctant to share their exploit techniques. It's almost like they're more valuable than bugs. And of course, this is anecdotal, but we really could be on the precipice of really increasing exploitation difficulty. So those were the main problems of 2014. Where are we now? I would say the main problems are software quality, transparency, patching, and mitigations. Of course, we've progressed a lot, but the same fundamental areas contain both the causes of and solutions to 0 days. But I want to add one more problem that has emerged: security gap. Security gap is the reality that vendors differ greatly in security practices. The best we see can be great, but it is way, way better than the worst we see, and the gap is widening. I've heard this problem called security poverty and security haves and have-nots, but I've never liked these terms because they imply lack of resources as a cause, when it is just one of many factors. So I suggest the term security gap. Most security gap is in middleware, software that is not sold directly to users. For example, maybe a mobile device has a camera driver that uses a third-party image library, and that's the one that has the security gap. But occasionally this happens on direct consumer software as well. And it's not clear what causes it. One possibility, as I mentioned earlier, is a lack of resources, but we don't see this only in low-margin software. A more likely scenario is lack of incentive. Security problems don't affect all vendors the same way. Something else I've heard, though I'm not sure if it's really a factor, is that if a middleware vendor doesn't live up to its patch obligations, there's not much vendors of software reliant on it can do, as switching to a new vendor takes lots of resources. One thing that is clear is that attackers have started to notice. We are seeing more 0 days in the wild targeting software made by vendors who are less equipped to fix vulnerabilities and prevent exploitation. So what should we make of everything that's happened? Of all these problems, it's made me reflect on security research as a solution. One way to see Project Zero is that we are using vulnerability research to drive security improvements in software. And from 10 years of this, I've learned what security research can do. It illuminates the security properties of software, especially exploitable defects, and makes attackers' capabilities apparent. It holds vendors accountable for the decisions they make surrounding security by making their effect visible. It can put pressure on vendors, especially with regards to the effort it takes to fix researcher-reported issues. And it generates ideas and information on how to make software more resilient to 0 days. But I've also learned what security research does not do. It does not write robust patches, implement secure development practices, perform consistent ongoing testing, or ship mitigations. Vendors do that. 5 years ago, when Ben Hawks gave our teams 5 years of Project Zero talk, we suggested that other organizations create their own Project Zero, that there be many Project Zeros. And while there is a lot we could do if there were 10 times as many people or 100 times as many people doing the type of work that Project Zero does, it is becoming increasingly apparent that security research is not enough to end the era of 0 days. Living in the San Francisco Bay Area, people often ask me if I'm a programmer. I sometimes make the joke, I don't write software. I just complain about it. And here we are, Project Zero, 10 years strong, still complaining about software. And we've made big strides in that time, especially with regards to bug density, patching, mitigations, and general understanding of 0-day attacks. And the team will consider to increase our knowledge of what is possible. But we're not in the place to make the next big changes that need to happen to protect users from 0 days. Vendors are. And this is not an easy task. And many vendors have made a lot of progress since we started. But there is so much left to do. As the profound impact that 0 days have on our societies become more apparent, I call on vendors to pay attention to what we've learned. Number one, bugs are the root cause of 0 days. All paths to protecting users involve reducing exploitable vulnerabilities in software and fixing known issues quickly and completely. There are no shortcuts. Any security program that does not hold this as a fundamental truth will fail. And bugs exist for a user, no matter what vendor wrote them, until that user is patched. Number two, we've now reached a point where mitigations have vast potential to improve software. Memory tagging is especially promising, but it's important to understand the role of mitigations. The best case scenario is that mitigations make the attacker's job harder. They are not substitute for robust software, and they too need to be verified for implementation correctness. Number three, we need to be transparent. Transparency keeps us all accountable and helps us understand the problems we all face. Don't be fooled. There is a tremendous benefit to helping others see what the attacks of today truly look like. Defenders working together openly is what attackers truly fear. So what will the next 10 years look like? I think that's up to everyone in this room. Will we make software more robust? Implement mitigations? Do comprehensive patching? Be transparent? Or will I be up here giving a 20 years of Project Zero talk, complaining that not enough has changed? Project Zero plans to keep pushing, expanding our understanding of 0 days, keeping vendors transparent, and putting pressure on industry to move forward. But we need others to act. It will take all of us to end the era of 0 days. Thanks so much, everyone.